you've seen a conversation around Brazil at the moment. We watch the situation in China. We watch what's happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Maybe an important moment to look at where our continent is in a changing world, to look at today's matrics, the people who wrote their first exam today, and think, where are they going to be? If you look at how China's economy is growing much more quickly than the US, there are also huge risks to the world, particularly around war, conflict and climate change. The Institute for Security Studies has been looking at various scenarios to look at how our continent is likely to fare during the next 40 years or so. Dr. Jakkie Cilliers is the head of African Futures and Innovation at the Institute for Security Studies. Dr. Cilliers, good afternoon to you and thank you. Firstly, if you look at how our continent has done relative to South America and Asia, if you look at the wealth of people, the official phrase is GDP per capita, what do we see? How's Africa done?
Stephen, there have been periods, particularly during the 90s, when Africa has not done badly because of the global commodities boom. But in general, actually going back to the 1960s, the gap between GDP per capita between Africa and the rest of the world, including other developing regions such as South America and South Asia, has been widening. So things are improving in Africa, but in general, we are falling further and further behind the averages in the rest of the world, and that is very concerning.
Do we know why we're falling behind? Is there maybe a sort of governance issue in terms of moving away from the colonial period to a more economically free period?
Stephen, so development is a complicated thing. It's like being healthy. You don't only need to eat enough carbohydrates and have vitamins and exercise and get enough sleep. You have to do all of those things. And that's the reason why Africa is falling further and further behind. So we are not we haven't had an agricultural revolution in Africa. We are not industrializing. We don't yet have a continental free trade area. Therefore, markets are small. We are falling behind in provision of health, and so on and so forth. So there's not one explanation. There is a series of explanations. The root of all of that has a lot to do with colonialism and the disruption that befell Africa during colonialism, and then the extent to which we were trapped during the Cold War between the East and the West and the rising competition between them. So there's a host of explanations. And books have been written about this, how to make the African economy more productive. But development takes a long time, and it is a slow process. For example, take education. Before a kid contributes effectively to an economy, he's got to go through primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and perhaps tertiary or a technical college. Let's say that's, 10, 12, 15 years. So something like education, where Africa is falling significantly behind indicators in the rest of the world, takes really, really a long time.
All of this is happening in a changing world, and you talk particularly around China and the United States, and really, to put it another way, it may be China and the West. I mean, that may be a sort of unfair way of putting it. But China's economy is expected to overtake that of the United States. How is that going to change the world?
So we've just done long-term global forecasts where we look at different worlds along different dimensions, and we started off by looking at where power is going. If we say there is 100% power in the world, who has most of it? And at the moment, that is the United States. And it is followed by the European Union, the 27 member states. But then you see China rising. Now, our forecasts would indicate that China would overtake the United States in the early 2040s, in about, 15, 16 years' time, as the most powerful country in the world. But the West, consisting of the European Union plus the United States, will still dominate globally, which means that the relationship between Europe and the US becomes very critical in our forecast. So, if somebody like Donald Trump is re-elected as president of the United States and starts fighting with everybody, the dominance of the West may become a problem. But it's not like China is going to overtake the West. We're probably ending with a world that consists of three global powers, the European Union, the United States, and China. And then a lot depends on what happens in the relationships between the United States and the West, and what happens with India, and what happens in Asia. Because remember, Asia, China is surrounded by a number of quite hostile countries to China, and you've got Japan, South Korea, and so on, who generally consider themselves part of the West rather than orientating towards China. So a complicated picture, but a world that is that is moving rapidly and changing very rapidly, and this power transition, as we see at the moment, is very unsettling to Africa.
You bring up the possibility of a major power implosion. I mean, is that Donald Trump for a second term in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so we say these forecasts that we've done could be impacted by a great power implosion. In the case of Russia, which is not a great power, that would be the democratization of Russia. In the case of China, the same story. The democratization of China would have huge implications for China and for Africa, because it would probably be accompanied by significant domestic turbulence. Of course, let's look at the European Union. If the European Union were to expand to eventually include Turkey and a democratic Russia, it could change the EU. But of course, on the other hand, the European Union could shrink. Countries may leave it, although I think the example of Brexit is a lesson to everybody. And then finally, the United States is becoming so divided that some commentators speak of, I wouldn't say civil war, but intense, violent competition within the United States. So great power implosion, either in the case of the United States, in the case of the European Union, which could also extend, or in the case of China, could have dramatic implications for where this global world is moving.
Does that mean that as Africa we also need to be very careful who we, to use the English phrase, hitch our wagon to, who we support?
Yes.
You know, we need to make sure that we actually are heading in the direction the world's heading, not going the wrong way.
Yes, so we make the argument in this piece of work that Africa cannot make a choice. We need the United States, we need Europe, we need China. And what we don't need is bipolarity on steroids, is a return to where we were during the Cold War and being forced to choose. Africa can't choose. Our interests is in actual fact a world where probably China and the West learn to coexist with one another, which is still a globalized world, but perhaps a world with two sets of rules, because our analysis would indicate very clearly it's not that the West is going to get China to change, the Communist Party is not going to change, and China is not going to get the West to change its focus on human rights and democracy. So Africa's interest is to make sure that some kind of rapprochement occur between the West and China, that we get back to a world that at least holds together, that is not a divided world where Africa is again pushed to make a choice. We can't make a choice.
All of this, I mean, makes sense, and these are things that we have control of. What we don't have control of are probably two major dangers that you point to. The one is climate change, and we know that that's already going to affect Southern Africa perhaps twice as much as other parts of the world. And the other is a sort of global conflict, the kind of Russian invasion of Ukraine spiraling out of control in some way. How scared are you of those?
Those are, I think climate change is the biggest threat of all. I personally doubt that we're going to see World War III, but let's first speak about climate change. I think in our scenarios, and there are 4 scenarios, a sustainable world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. We are sort of headed towards the divided world at the moment. We are saying that climate change really could serve as that thing that forces coherence in the world, because as the evidence of climate change mounts, and as countries see what is happening, we may find that the global system responds, as it always does belatedly. So climate change, without a doubt, presents the global community, Africa in particular, with huge problems. But there is the chance that China would decide to take Taiwan and invade it, and that the US becomes involved, or that China and India engage in a war. Two great powers very seldom peacefully coexist, or that the Ukraine conflict escalates, as Russia has threatened, into a war with NATO, and so on and so forth. Though that, what we refer to as a world at war scenario, would affect everybody. Poverty would increase, Africa would grow slowly, and carbon emissions would go through the roof. Really a bad situation. So Africa's interests are to work towards a sustainable world, a world that facilitates Africa's development, and that allows for a degree of accommodation of the interests of the West, of China, because, as I've said, Africa needs the collaboration and the support of the United States, of the European Union, of China, and everybody else, if we are to deal with this growing gap in incomes and other indices where things are improving, but where we are steadily falling further behind global averages.
We spoke to an expert on curriculum development, a professor of curriculum development, about the matric exams, which, as you know, Dr. Cilliers, started today. You mentioned that we're falling behind in education. That's obviously the place to start, what people talk about as the silver bullet, if it works well.
Yes, education is important, but education is a very slow mover of change. So Africa falls behind in both the quantity and the quality of education. Now, when you do long-term forecasting, quality is more important than quantity. And at the moment, education levels in Africa, the quality of education in Africa is particularly low, and we are not doing sufficient technical, vocational training and so on and so forth. But education on its own will not change Africa. We also have to do the other things. We have to integrate in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We have to make our population more healthy and more productive. We have to go up the agricultural ladder. We have to do the manufacturing transition. All of these things are necessary. There's no single bullet. Leapfrogging can help. But leapfrogging, again, to put it in simple terms, people need household electricity and they need internet access if they are to be able to benefit from leapfrogging technology, for example, in education. So, again, development is an integrated whole of systems approach, and putting all of those things together is a challenge for the continent. It's not only one of them that's going to change our destiny.
Dr. Jakkie Cilliers, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. Head of African Futures and Innovation at the Institute for Security Studies.